History remembers the battles. It forgets the laboratories. And sometimes the greatest horrors never happened on the battlefield at all. In the shadows of World War II, while armies clashed across continents, a secret operation unfolded behind locked doors in occupied China. It wasn't designed to defeat soldiers. It was designed to break the human body itself. Official records would later vanish. Witnesses were silenced. Entire facilities were dismantled as if they had never existed. But buried beneath the ruins was a program so extreme that even wartime brutality couldn't explain it away. This was not a rogue operation. It was funded, protected, and strategically approved. Japan's military leadership believed modern war would be won not just with bombs and bullets, but with biological domination. Disease, cold, starvation, human limits pushed beyond survival. To prepare for that future, they needed data, not from animals, from people, prisoners of war, civilians, children. They were transported in secret to a sprawling complex known only by a code name, Unit 731. On the surface, it was a water purification facility. Beneath it was something far darker. Doctors in military uniforms replaced healers' tools with scalpels, pathogens, and temperature chambers. They didn't ask how to save lives. They asked how long a body could endure pain before collapsing. What happens when organs shut down? How disease spreads fastest? How much suffering can be weaponized? For years, these experiments continued unnoticed by the outside world. And when the war finally ended, the truth should have exploded into history. Instead, it disappeared. But what happened inside Unit 731 was only beginning to surface. And the full extent of what they did would shock even seasoned war investigators. Behind the high walls of the compound, science abandoned morality. Unit 731 functioned like a factory of human destruction, disguised as medical research. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. Doctors observed symptoms as bodies deteriorated in real time. No treatment was ever given, not because they couldn't help, because suffering was the data. Some victims were exposed to extreme cold until their limbs froze solid, then thawed repeatedly to study frostbite. Others were placed in pressure chambers to simulate high altitudes until organs ruptured. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia. The goal was clarity: how organs failed, how blood loss progressed, how infections spread through living systems. Researchers believed this knowledge would give Japan a biological warfare advantage capable of crippling enemy populations without firing a single shot. Field tests soon followed. Diseased insects were released into villages. Water sources were contaminated. Entire communities became unknowing laboratories. Thousands died not from bombs, but from invisible weapons engineered in sterile rooms. To the scientists, victims weren't people. They were logs. That was the term used in records. Logs to be burned through for results. The experiments grew more extreme as the war intensified. Time was running out. Data had to be gathered fast. But as Japan's defeat approached, something else became urgent. Erasing evidence. Buildings were destroyed. Prisoners were executed. Documents were burned. The goal wasn't just ending the project. It was making sure no one would ever fully know what had happened. Yet the silence that followed the war would prove even more disturbing than the experiments themselves. Because the people responsible wouldn't face justice, they would be protected. For the victims, there was no recognition. No graves, no official names, no public mourning. Entire families vanished into the system and were never seen again. Survivors who escaped nearby test zones described sudden outbreaks of illness that killed neighbors within days. Skin lesions, high fevers, internal bleeding, bodies overwhelmed by engineered disease. Communities collapsed without understanding why. Years later, the trauma lingered. Children born with complications. Regions with long-term health damage. A silence enforced by fear and political pressure. But the deepest ethical wound came after the war ended. Instead of prosecuting the scientists behind Unit 731, American intelligence made a calculated decision. The research data was too valuable. In exchange for full immunity, Japanese doctors handed over their findings on biological warfare and human experimentation. No trials, no prison sentences, no public acknowledgement. While Nazi doctors were prosecuted in Nuremberg, Unit 731's leaders returned to civilian life. Some became respected professors. Others entered pharmaceutical research. Men who had dissected living humans went on to build medical careers. The victims received nothing. No justice, no compensation, not even official confirmation of what happened. Governments quietly archived the truth. And for decades, history textbooks barely mentioned Unit 731 at all. The world moved forward, built partly on knowledge extracted from unimaginable suffering. And that may be the darkest legacy of all. It wasn't until the late 20th century that survivors, historians, and leaked documents began piecing together what had truly occurred. The scale was far greater than early estimates, the cruelty far more systematic. Unit 731 was not an isolated horror. It was a state-sponsored research empire built on human expendability. Yet even today, full accountability has never arrived. Many official records remain classified. Some governments still avoid formal apologies. The immunity deals were never undone. What's left is a fractured historical memory. In Japan, public awareness remains limited. In China and Korea, the trauma runs deep. In the West, the story is often overshadowed by other wartime atrocities. But the ethical questions haven't faded. Modern biological research, military experimentation, and classified programs all trace back to lessons learned in secret. Unit 731 proved how easily science can become a weapon when morality is labeled an obstacle. It showed that governments will bury crimes if the knowledge is useful enough. And it revealed how victims can vanish from history while perpetrators are quietly rewarded. The buildings are gone. The documents are scattered. Many witnesses are dead. But the consequences remain. Not just in damaged communities, but in the precedent it set. That in times of fear, human lives can become expendable. That progress can be built on suffering. And that the most dangerous experiments are the ones no one is ever punished for. Some crimes end with war. Others become the foundation of the future. When the Tokyo war crimes trials began, the world believed justice was finally catching up with the architects of wartime brutality. But behind closed doors, another negotiation was unfolding, quieter, colder, more calculated. American occupation authorities, now facing the emerging tensions of the Cold War, were no longer focused solely on punishing past crimes. They were looking ahead. The Soviet Union was expanding influence across Asia. Biological warfare was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a strategic possibility. And Unit 731's data was unique. No Western nation had conducted large-scale human experimentation on biological weapons with such systematic documentation. The moral cost was staggering. The scientific detail was unprecedented. U.S. intelligence officials interviewed former Unit 731 personnel in secret. Reports were classified, recommendations were drafted. Eventually, a decision was made: prosecute and risk the data falling into Soviet hands, or grant immunity and secure exclusive access. They chose access. General Douglas MacArthur's Occupation Administration quietly ensured that key figures, including Unit 731 Commander Shiro Ishii, would not face indictment. In exchange, they handed over research findings, laboratory notes, and operational insights. There would be no public reckoning. While Nazi medical experiments were exposed in the Nuremberg doctors' trial, Unit 731's atrocities remained largely absent from global headlines. The contrast was stark. In Germany, the horrors became a cautionary tale. In Japan, they became a classified file. The decision had consequences beyond justice. It shaped the early trajectory of Cold War biological research. American programs expanded in secrecy, studying pathogens, delivery systems, and defensive strategies. Officially, these were precautionary measures. Unofficially, the ethical line had already shifted. The knowledge extracted from Unit 731 blurred the boundary between condemnation and utilization. It forced governments into a moral contradiction: denounce in public, benefit in private. And for decades, that contradiction remained hidden. Declassified documents in the 1980s and 1990s slowly revealed fragments of the truth. Survivors' testimonies gained international attention. Historians uncovered correspondence proving that immunity was deliberate policy, not oversight. But by then, most perpetrators were elderly or gone. Justice delayed had become justice denied. The Cold War had long ended, yet the ethical compromise made in its earliest years lingered like a quiet stain on international law. It raised a question governments rarely confront openly. If knowledge gained through atrocity strengthens national security, will morality always be negotiable? Unit 731 did not just test biological weapons, it tested the limits of accountability. And history's answer was unsettling. Today, Unit 731 stands as more than a wartime secret. It is a warning embedded in modern science and global politics. In Harbin, the former site of the complex has been partially preserved as a museum. Concrete foundations remain where laboratories once stood. Rusted equipment sits behind glass. Visitors walk through corridors that once echoed with classified research. For some, it is a memorial. For others, it is unfinished business. International law now prohibits biological warfare under treaties like the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. Nations publicly commit to transparency and ethical standards. Oversight committees monitor research. Institutional review boards demand informed consent. On paper, the world learned its lesson. But secrecy has not disappeared. Classified laboratories still exist. Military-funded research continues under national security justifications. Governments insist these programs are defensive. Critics warn that lines can shift quickly when fear enters the equation. Technological advancements have only amplified the stakes. Modern genetic engineering allows for precision that scientists in the 1940s could barely imagine. Pathogens can be studied, modified, and modeled with unprecedented sophistication. The power to manipulate life has grown exponentially, which makes the memory of Unit 731 even more urgent. Its story forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Scientific progress is not inherently moral. It reflects the intentions of those who control it. When authority operates without oversight, when nationalism overrides humanity, laboratories can become weapons. The silence surrounding Unit 731 also reshaped collective memory. For decades, victims' families struggled for acknowledgement. Lawsuits were filed in Japanese courts seeking apology and compensation. Most were dismissed on technical grounds tied to post-war treaties. Legal closure never arrived. Yet awareness continues to expand. Scholars publish new research. Documentaries bring hidden archives to light. Survivors' descendants speak publicly. The erasure attempted in 1945 is slowly unraveling, and that may be the final lesson. You can dismantle buildings. You can burn documents. You can classify the truth. But history has a way of resurfacing. Unit 731 reminds us that the most dangerous threat is not always the weapon itself. It is the belief that power justifies its use. Some experiments end. Their consequences echo for generations.